Sometimes the most dangerous secrets hide behind the most ordinary faces. In the village of Thornwick, where winter nights stretch long and ancient stones hold memories, a woman named Elaria arrives for the winter feast, like any other traveller seeking warmth and shelter. She's past 50, with silver threading through her hair and hands that have known both healing and hardship. But when she stands and speaks words in perfect Latin during the feast, everything changes. The alpha vampire recognizes the ancient tongue of the Old Pact, a language only spoken by those connected to bloodlines thought dead for centuries. "Don't let her leave," he commands, because he knows what this quiet woman represents. What secret has Elaria carried all these years? And why does her simple blessing threaten to unravel everything? Before we continue with this tale of forgotten oaths and buried memories, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Thornwick had stood at the edge of the ancient Blackwood forest for over 6 centuries, its stone foundations weathered by countless winters, yet enduring like the people who called it home. Tonight, as snow fell in gentle spirals beyond the diamond-paned windows of the great hall, the annual winter feast brought together souls from across the northern reaches. Nobles in their finest velvet and fur, grizzled hunters with stories etched in their weathered faces, and travellers whose origins remained as mysterious as the shadows that danced between the flickering torches. Elaria Montrose pulled her worn woolen cloak closer as she stepped through the massive oak doors, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air that rushed in with her arrival. At 57, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world with quiet confidence, neither drawing attention nor fading entirely into the background. Her silver-streaked auburn hair was braided simply and coiled beneath a modest hood, and her hands, skilled hands that had delivered countless babies and tended innumerable wounds, carried a leather satchel that never left her side. The hall itself was a marvel of medieval craftsmanship, its vaulted ceiling supported by massive timber beams that had been hewn from the very forest that surrounded them. Tapestries covered the stone walls, their rich colours depicting scenes of harvest festivals, royal hunts, and mysterious figures in flowing robes who seemed to watch the proceedings with eternal vigilance. The largest tapestry, hanging behind the Lord's table, showed an intricate scene of men and women in noble dress standing before creatures of shadow and moonlight, their hands joined in what appeared to be some form of ancient covenant. Lord Matthias Blackthorne presided over the gathering from his carved chair, not quite a throne, but close enough to command respect. He appeared to be a man in his prime, perhaps 40 years of age, with dark hair that caught the firelight and eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience beyond his apparent years. His clothing was rich, but not ostentatious, a deep burgundy doublet with silver threading and a heavy chain of office that gleamed against his chest. When he spoke, which was rarely, the entire hall listened. Elaria had arrived 3 days prior, seeking shelter during a particularly harsh snowstorm that had caught her travelling between villages. The innkeeper's wife, a kindly woman named Margaret, had offered her a room in exchange for tending to her daughter's persistent fever. It was a bargain Elaria had made countless times during her years as a travelling healer, her skills for shelter, her knowledge for sustenance. She asked for little and gave much, a pattern that had served her well since she had begun her wandering life more than 2 decades ago. "You've gentle hands," Margaret had observed, watching Elaria prepare a tincture of willow bark and elderberry for the child. Not many know the old ways of healing anymore. Most folk just pray and hope for the best. Elaria had smiled, carefully measuring the precious herbs from her satchel. Prayer has its place, but the earth provides medicines for those who know where to look and how to prepare them. My grandmother taught me that knowledge is meant to be shared, not hoarded. What she hadn't mentioned was that her grandmother had been the chief healer to a royal court, or that the techniques she employed had been passed down through generations of women who had served kings and queens. Some memories were better left undisturbed, like sediment at the bottom of a still pond. The feast tonight was unlike anything Elaria had experienced in her travels. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, wheels of aged cheese, and winter vegetables prepared with herbs she could smell from across the room. Mead and ale flowed freely, and the conversation hummed with the comfortable warmth of a community that genuinely cared for its members. Yet underneath the festivities, she sensed something else, an undercurrent of anticipation, as if everyone waited for something significant to unfold. "You're new to our celebration," came a voice beside her. Elaria turned to find a young man, perhaps 30 years of age, with sandy hair and kind blue eyes. He wore the simple brown robes of a village priest, though something in his bearing suggested depths beyond his apparent calling. "I'm Father Benedict, though most folk just call me Ben. You must be the healer Margaret spoke of." "Elaria," she replied, extending her hand. "I'm grateful for the village's hospitality. It's been some time since I've experienced such warmth." Ben's grip was firm, and she noticed calluses on his palms that spoke of work beyond blessing bread and wine. Thornwick has always welcomed travellers, especially during the harsh months. "Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual about our little village?" The question struck her as odd, but before she could respond, a commotion near the Lord's table drew their attention. A group of late arrivals had entered, and their presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere of the hall. They moved with predatory grace, their clothing rich but somehow timeless in style, as if fashion meant nothing to them. Their skin was pale as moonlight, and when they smiled, which they did often, their teeth seemed unnaturally sharp. "Ah," Ben murmured, his voice carrying a note of resignation. "The night visitors have arrived." Lord Matthias rose from his seat, raising a silver goblet that caught the firelight. "Friends, neighbors and honored guests," his voice carried easily through the hall, "welcome to this year's winter feast. As has been our tradition for generations, we gather on the longest night to celebrate the bonds that hold our community together, bonds that transcend the ordinary boundaries of life and death, of mortal and immortal." Elaria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air still clinging to her cloak. The silver pendant she wore beneath her dress, a piece she had carried since childhood but never quite understood, seemed to grow warm against her skin. The pale newcomers took their places at the tables that had apparently been reserved for them, and Elaria noticed how other guests seemed to give them respectful space. Not fearful, exactly, but aware, very aware. "Every year," Lord Matthias continued, "we renew the ancient pacts that have kept our village safe and prosperous. Tonight, we honor both the living and those who exist beyond the veil of ordinary mortality." As if responding to some unspoken signal, the assembled crowd began to settle into their seats. Servants moved efficiently between the tables, ensuring that goblets remained filled and platters replenished. The hall fell into the comfortable rhythm of a feast that had been celebrated the same way for centuries. Elaria found herself seated at a table with other travellers and village newcomers. To her left sat a merchant from the southern provinces, his cart loaded with spices and silks that would fetch good prices in the northern settlements. To her right, an elderly woman who introduced herself simply as Elena watched the proceedings with eyes that seemed to hold their own secrets. "Tell me, child," Elena said quietly, her voice barely audible above the general conversation. "What brings you to Thornwick at this particular time of year?" "Chance," Elaria replied honestly. "The storm caught me on the road between Millhaven and Brookshire. I was grateful to find shelter." Elena studied her face in the flickering candlelight. "Chance is rarely as random as we think. Sometimes the roads lead us exactly where we need to be, even when we don't understand why." Before Elaria could respond to this cryptic observation, Lord Matthias called for attention once again. "As is our custom, we begin this feast with a blessing. Let any who feel moved to speak offer words of gratitude for the year past and hope for the year to come." Several villagers rose in turn, offering simple prayers and expressions of thanksgiving. Their words were heartfelt but unremarkable. Gratitude for good harvests, for healthy children, for neighbors who had helped during difficult times. The pale visitors listened politely, but did not participate. Then, without fully understanding why, Elaria felt herself rising to her feet. The silver pendant beneath her dress seemed to pulse with warmth, and words came to her lips unbidden. Words in a language she had not spoken since her childhood, had barely remembered until this moment. "Benedictio antiqua, super nos descendat," her voice carried clearly through the now silent hall. "Et pactum veterum renovetur, in pace et justitia. Sanguis et spiritus, terra et caelum, mortales e immortal, omnes sub una lux vivamus." The ancient Latin blessing flowed from her tongue as naturally as breathing, each word precise and properly pronounced. As she spoke, she touched the pendant beneath her dress, and though none could see it, the silver disc grew warm enough that she could feel its heat through the fabric. The silence that followed her words was absolute. Every conversation stopped. Every movement ceased. Even the servants paused in their duties, platters suspended halfway to tables, wine goblets frozen in mid-pour. Lord Matthias had gone perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how exposed she was, standing alone in the great hall with hundreds of eyes upon her. But it was not fear she read in his expression. It was recognition. Slowly, deliberately, he set down his goblet and rose to his full height. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of authority that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the hall. "Don't let her leave." The words were quiet, almost conversational, but they hit Elaria like a physical blow. Around the hall, she saw the pale visitors straightening in their seats, suddenly alert in a way that reminded her of hunting cats spotting prey. Whatever game had been playing out in Thornwick, she had just become a central piece. Elena's hand found hers beneath the table, squeezing gently. "Steady, child," the old woman whispered. "Your journey has truly begun now." The weight of Lord Matthias's words settled over the great hall like a heavy blanket, muffling even the crackle of the massive fireplace. Elaria remained standing, her hand still pressed against the warm silver pendant beneath her dress, acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted in the space between her Latin blessing and his quiet command. "My lord," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "I'm not certain I understand. I offered only a traditional blessing for the feast." "Lord." Matthias descended from the raised platform where his table sat, moving with fluid grace that seemed almost otherworldly. As he drew closer, Elaria noticed details that had escaped her attention before. The way his skin held a subtle luminescence in the firelight, how his eyes seemed to capture and reflect the flames with an intensity that was decidedly unnatural. "Traditional," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with what might have been amusement. "Tell me, Elaria of the healing hands, where did you learn such traditional words? That blessing you spoke, it's written in the tongue of the Old Pact, a language not heard in these halls for more than 50 years. Behind him, the pale visitors had risen from their seats as one, forming a loose semicircle that effectively blocked the main exits from the hall. Their movement was coordinated, practiced, and Elaria understood with crystalline clarity that she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a village feast. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though even as the words left her lips, fragments of memory began to surface. A grand hall with soaring windows. A woman with auburn hair like her own, speaking in that same flowing Latin, while men in rich robes listened with grave attention. Her own child's voice, repeating the words until they became as natural as breathing. Lord Matthias stopped just beyond arm's reach, studying her face with the intensity of someone reading a complex manuscript. "The Old Pact," he said slowly, "was an agreement forged between the mortal nobility and those of us who exist beyond the boundaries of natural death. It established territories, responsibilities, and most importantly, bloodlines that served as bridges between our two worlds. Those bloodlines carried specific obligations and protections." Eleanor's hand was still gripping hers beneath the table, and the old woman's fingers trembled slightly. Around them, the other villagers sat frozen, caught between confusion and a growing sense that they were witnessing something momentous. "The language of the pact," Lord Matthias continued, "was taught only to those of covenant blood. It served as identification, proof of lineage and authority. When you spoke those words with such fluency, such perfect pronunciation—" He paused, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me your family name." "Montrose," Elaria replied automatically, then felt a jolt of recognition as the name seemed to echo strangely in the vast hall. One of the pale visitors, a woman with platinum hair and cold blue eyes, stepped forward. "Montrose," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that nonetheless held undertones of ice. "I knew that line. They served the court at Ravenshollow until—" She stopped abruptly, exchanging a meaningful glance with Lord Matthias. "Until what?" Elaria demanded, feeling pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed beginning to shift in her mind. Lord Matthias moved to the wall where the ancient tapestry hung, gesturing to the figures depicted there. "Until the night of the shattered crown, when political ambitions and old grudges destroyed 3 noble houses and nearly broke the pact entirely. The Montrose family disappeared that night. Most assumed they had been killed with the others." As he spoke, images flashed through Elaria's mind with startling vividness, running through dark corridors while her mother clutched her hand, shouting voices behind them, the clash of steel on steel, her father's face, grim and determined, pressing something into her small hands, the silver pendant she had worn ever since. "Remember what this means," her father's voice echoed across the decades, though she hadn't consciously recalled those words until this moment. "Remember what you are, and trust no one until you understand the full price of our blood." "The Montrose line," the platinum-haired woman said thoughtfully, "held the key to the Covenant protocols. They were the arbiters, the ones who could modify or dissolve the agreements between our peoples. If she truly carries that bloodline, then she represents either our salvation or our destruction," Lord Matthias finished grimly. Father Benedict had been watching the exchange with growing alarm, and now he stepped forward. "Lord Matthias, surely this is a matter for private discussion. The lady appears to have no knowledge of these ancient affairs." "Doesn't she?" The question came from behind Elaria, and she turned to see that Elena had risen from the table. But the elderly woman she had been speaking with moments before seemed somehow different, straighter, more commanding, and her eyes held a sharpness that spoke of deep intelligence and careful observation. "Grandmother Eleanor," Lord Matthias said, inclining his head respectfully, "I wondered when you would reveal yourself." Elena smiled, and in that expression, Elaria saw echoes of her own features, the shape of the eyes, the curve of the jaw. "Hello, dear child," she said gently. "I've been waiting a very long time to see you again." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "Again?" Elaria whispered. "You were 7 years old when your parents brought you to me," Elena explained, her voice soft with memory. "They knew the old agreements were failing, that the court had become a dangerous place for covenant bloodlines. I helped them disappear, gave them new identities, and promised to watch over you should anything happen to them. But they died of fever when I was 12, Elaria protested, even as more memories began to surface. Her parents hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way her mother would sometimes speak Latin in her sleep, her father's insistence that she learn to read and write, unusual for a girl of common birth. They died protecting the secret of what you are, Eleanor said firmly. And I've spent the last 45 years moving from village to village, keeping track of your movements, ensuring you stayed safe until the time came for you to reclaim your heritage. Lord Matthias withdrew a leather-bound tome from beneath his cloak, an ancient book with brass clasps and pages yellowed with age. "The Book of Old Pacts," he said, setting it carefully on the nearest table. "Every covenant bloodline is recorded here, along with their specific abilities and responsibilities. If you are truly Catherine Montrose's daughter—" "Catherine," Elaria breathed, the name hitting her like a physical blow. That had been her mother's true name, not the simple Mary she had used during their years of hiding. The book fell open, as if it knew exactly which page to reveal. And there, illuminated in gold and deep blue ink, was a family tree that showed the Montrose lineage stretching back over 3 centuries. At the bottom, in fresh ink that gleamed in the firelight, was her own name, Elaria Montrose, daughter of Catherine, heir to the Covenant authority. "The power to bind and release supernatural agreements," Lord Matthias read from the ancient text. "The authority to modify territorial boundaries and establish new terms of coexistence. The responsibility to serve as final arbiter in disputes between mortal and immortal houses." He looked up at her, his expression grave. "Do you understand now why you cannot simply leave?" Around the hall, the villagers watched in stunned silence as their simple winter feast transformed into something from legend. The pale visitors, vampires Elaria now understood, studied her with mixture of hope and wariness that suggested her newfound knowledge carried consequences she couldn't yet imagine. "I'm a healer," she said weakly. "I tend sick children and help women through difficult births. I don't know anything about supernatural politics or ancient agreements." "Knowledge can be taught," the platinum-haired vampire said, her voice carrying an edge of steel. "Bloodline cannot be changed. The question, Lord Matthias, is whether she'll serve the purposes of order or chaos." Elena moved to stand beside Elaria, her presence offering comfort in a world that had suddenly become vast and dangerous. "The choice, as always, belongs to her," she said firmly. "The blood may carry obligation, but the heart decides how that obligation will be fulfilled." Lord Matthias closed the ancient book with a decisive snap. "Then we have much to discuss. Guards, please escort our honored guest to the Solar. She'll be staying with us until we can properly assess the situation." "You mean I'm a prisoner?" Elaria said. "You're protected," he corrected. "The knowledge of your existence will spread quickly now. There are forces in this world that would use your authority for their own ends, and others who would kill you rather than risk any change to the current balance of power." As vampire guards moved to flank her, Elaria felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The simple life she had built, the quiet satisfaction of healing and helping, it was gone, replaced by responsibilities she didn't understand, and powers she had never wanted. But as she looked at Elena's encouraging smile and felt the warm pulse of the pendant against her skin, she also felt something else stirring within her, the echo of ancient strength, passed down through generations of women who had stood between worlds and held the balance steady. Her grandmother had been right. The roads did lead us exactly where we needed to be, even when we didn't understand the destination. The Solar where Elaria found herself was a far cry from the simple inn-room she had occupied for the past 3 days. Located in the upper reaches of Lord Matthias's manor, the circular chamber featured tall windows that looked out over the snow-covered village and the dark expanse of blackwood forest beyond. Heavy tapestries covered the stone walls, and a fire crackled warmly in an ornate hearth carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light. Despite the comfortable furnishings, a bed with rich velvet curtains, chairs upholstered in fine leather, a writing desk stocked with parchment and ink, Elaria understood that comfort did not equate to freedom. The door, while not visibly locked, was undoubtedly guarded. The windows, though they let in pale morning light, were far too high for any practical escape. She had spent a restless night, haunted by memories that surfaced like pieces of driftwood washing ashore after a storm. Her mother's face, younger than Elaria remembered, but etched with the same worry lines that had deepened in their years of hiding. Her father's hands, strong and gentle, teaching her to read from books whose significance she had never understood. The silver pendant, always the pendant, warm against her skin, even when everything else felt cold and uncertain. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Come in," she called, expecting perhaps a servant with breakfast, or Elena with more revelations about their shared past. Instead, a young man entered, one of the pale visitors from the feast, though in daylight filtering through the windows, she could see details that had been hidden in the hall's shadowy illumination. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that held an unexpected warmth. Unlike the predatory grace she had observed in the others, his movements seemed careful, almost hesitant. "Lady Elaria," he said formally, though something in his voice suggested the title felt strange on his tongue. "I'm Marcus Thorn. Lord Matthias is—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Student, I suppose you might say. I've brought your breakfast, and I hoped we might speak." He carried a silver tray laden with fresh bread, honey, preserves, and what smelled like genuine tea, a luxury she hadn't enjoyed in months of travel. More importantly, he had brought her leather satchel, the one containing her healing supplies that she had left at the inn. "My belongings," she said, moving quickly to examine the satchel's contents. Everything appeared to be there. The carefully organized packets of herbs, the small bottles of tinctures, the surgical implements that had belonged to her mother. "Lord Matthias thought you might need them," Marcus explained, setting the tray on the small table near the window. "There's been an accident in the village, A child fell through the ice on Miller's Pond. They managed to pull him out, but—" He gestured helplessly. Elaria was already moving, checking the contents of her satchel with practiced efficiency. "How long was he under? Is he breathing? What's his condition now?" "Perhaps 10 minutes," Marcus replied, following her as she headed toward the door. "He's alive, but barely conscious. They have him in the blacksmith's house. It's the warmest building in the village center." She stopped at the door, suddenly aware of the contradiction. "You're allowing me to leave?" Marcus met her eyes steadily. "Lord Matthias believes that actions reveal character more clearly than words. How you respond to a child in need will tell us much about who you truly are." The walk through Thornwick's snow-covered streets provided Elaria her first clear view of the village in daylight. It was larger than she had realized, with perhaps 200 souls calling it home. The buildings were well maintained, their thatched roofs and stone walls speaking of prosperity and careful stewardship. Gardens lay dormant beneath snow, but she could see the careful planning that would make them flourish come spring. More importantly, she observed how the villagers reacted to her passage. Some watched with open curiosity, whispering among themselves about the events at the feast. Others nodded respectfully, as if her newfound status as Covenant heir had somehow elevated her position in their eyes. But a few, particularly the older residents, watched with what appeared to be wariness, even fear. "They're afraid of what my presence might bring," she observed quietly, as they approached the blacksmith's substantial home. "Change is always frightening," Marcus replied. "The current arrangements have kept Thornwick safe for over 2 generations. The thought that those arrangements might be altered causes considerable anxiety." Inside the blacksmith's house, Elaria found organized chaos. The boy, perhaps 8 years old, lay on a makeshift bed near the forge, his lips blue and his breathing shallow. His mother knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face, while the blacksmith paced nervously, and several neighbors offered contradictory advice. "Please," Elaria said firmly, "I need space to work." Her voice carried an authority that surprised even her, and the room quickly cleared except for the parents and Marcus, who positioned himself near the door. She knelt beside the child, her hands moving with practiced skill as she assessed his condition. Hypothermia, certainly, but also signs of water in his lungs. His pulse was weak but steady, and his skin had the waxy pallor that spoke of a body fighting to preserve core heat. From her satchel, she withdrew several small bottles and packets. "I need hot water, as much as you can provide," she instructed the father, "and clean cloths. Linen, if you have it." As she worked, grinding herbs with a small mortar and pestle, mixing tinctures with precise measurements, Elaria felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents' deaths, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she belonged. This was her gift, her calling, regardless of whatever supernatural heritage ran in her blood. "What are you giving him?" Marcus asked quietly, watching as she prepared a compound that filled the room with the scent of mint and something sharper, more complex. "Angelica root to strengthen his heart," she explained, carefully measuring drops into a cup of hot water. "Ginger to improve circulation, and a preparation my mother taught me, willow bark and elderflower, with just a touch of something that helps the body fight the cold from within." What she didn't mention was that the final ingredient, a silvery powder she kept in the smallest vial, was something she had never seen in any herbalist's collection. Her mother had called it Moon's Blessing, and used it only in the most desperate cases. Elaria had never understood where it came from or how it worked, only that it did work, sometimes miraculously. As she lifted the boy's head and carefully encouraged him to swallow the mixture, his eyelids fluttered. Colour began to return to his cheeks, and his breathing deepened perceptibly. "Thomas," his mother whispered. "Thomas, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes opened, focusing slowly on his mother's face. "Cold," he mumbled, but even that single word was spoken with strength that hadn't been there minutes before. Around the room, she heard gasps of amazement, whispered prayers of gratitude. The transformation was dramatic enough to border on the miraculous, though Elaria knew it was simply the result of proper knowledge applied with skill and care. Marcus, however, was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The powder you used," he said quietly. "It's not entirely natural, is it?" She met his gaze steadily. "My mother never told me where it came from. She said some knowledge was earned through need, not explanation." "It's powdered moonstone," Marcus said softly, "prepared through alchemical processes that are known to very few. It enhances the natural healing properties of other compounds, but only when used by someone with the proper bloodline, someone who can channel intention through will." Elaria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air still clinging to her clothes. "You're saying I used magic?" "I'm saying you used abilities you inherited," Yao corrected. "The Covenant bloodlines didn't gain their authority through politics alone. They were chosen because they possessed natural gifts that bridged the gap between mortal and supernatural understanding." Outside, church bells began to ring, not the solemn tolling of tragedy, but the joyful pealing that announced good news to the entire village. Word of the boy's recovery was spreading, and with it, news of Elaria's role in his healing. "They'll see you differently now," Marcus warned, as voices outside grew louder with celebration. "Not just as a woman with mysterious heritage, but as someone with genuine power." Elaria gathered her supplies, carefully replacing each item in its proper place within the satchel. "Is that a problem?" "That depends," Marcus said, "on how you choose to use that power. And more importantly, on who else decides they need to control it." That evening, as snow continued to fall in gentle cascades beyond the windows of the solar, Marcus arrived with an armload of leather-bound volumes and a conspirative expression that immediately caught Elaria's attention. He had shed the formal manner of their morning interaction, and something in his bearing suggested he was acting without Lord Matthias's explicit approval. "I thought you might want to understand more about your heritage," he said quietly, setting the books on the writing desk. "These are copies of the village chronicles, dating back to Thornwick's founding. If you're going to navigate the political currents you've found yourself in, knowledge will be your greatest weapon." Elaria examined the volumes with growing interest. The leather covers were worn smooth by countless hands, and the brass clasps showed the patina of age. When she opened the topmost chronicle, the scent of old parchment and iron gall ink filled her nostrils, a smell that triggered memories of her father's study, where similar books had lined the walls. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, settling into the chair behind the desk. "This morning you were testing me on Lord Matthias's behalf. Now you're providing information that I suspect he might prefer I didn't have." Marcus moved to the window, gazing out at the village, where warm light spilled from cottage windows and smoke rose from chimneys into the starlit sky. "Because I've spent the last century watching him carry a burden that's slowly destroying him. The Covenant system is failing, Lady Elaria. The old agreements were made for a different world, and trying to maintain them in modern times has become increasingly difficult." "A century?" She looked up from the chronicle, studying his young face with new understanding. "You're much older than you appear." I was turned when I was 31, he said simply. That was in 1823. I've served Lord Matthias for most of the years since, watching him try to maintain peace between our peoples, while the foundations of that peace crumble beneath us. The chronicle in her hands detailed the founding of Thornwick in 1158, when a group of refugees from political upheaval in the southern kingdoms had sought sanctuary in the edgelands between mortal and supernatural territories. The early entries spoke of negotiations with the Pale Lords and agreements that would ensure mutual protection and prosperity. But as she read further, she began to notice changes in tone and content. References to the lost daughter of the Covenant appeared repeatedly in entries from the 1870s onward, along with increasingly worried discussions about the stability of territorial boundaries and the growing difficulty of maintaining the old ways in a changing world. Here, she said, pointing to a passage dated 1879. It mentions a child who was brought to the village for protection, someone whose bloodline made her too valuable to risk in the capital. The entry says she was raised by the wise woman of the northern reaches until it was safe for her to return to her proper station. Marcus nodded grimly. That child was your mother, Catherine. She lived here for nearly a decade, learning the old ways from the woman who would later become your grandmother Elena. When she finally returned to court, she carried with her a deep understanding of how the Covenant system was supposed to work, and how badly it had been corrupted. Elaria turned the pages carefully, finding entries that detailed Catherine's return to Ravenshollow and her marriage to William Montrose, a minor noble whose family had served the Covenant bloodlines for generations. Their union had been seen as a restoration of proper order, a chance to renew the ancient agreements with fresh wisdom and renewed commitment. What went wrong? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Politics, Marcus replied bitterly. There were factions within both the mortal nobility and the vampire houses who benefited from the confusion and instability. The clearer the Covenant lines became, the less power they could claim for themselves. When your parents began working to codify new agreements that would clarify territorial rights and responsibilities, they became targets, Elaria finished, remembering fragments of hurried conversations, her father's worried face, the night they had fled their home forever. Marcus moved away from the window, settling into the chair across from her. The attack on Ravenshollow was coordinated, planned by those who preferred chaos to order. Your parents fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. They escaped only because Elena had prepared contingency plans, safe houses, false identities, people who could help them disappear. But they died anyway, Elaria said quietly. When I was 12, they both fell sick with a fever that no healer could cure. They were poisoned, Marcus said gently, a slow-acting compound that mimics natural illness. It took investigators years to confirm, but by then the trail had gone cold. Your parents died protecting the secret of your location, never revealing where you had been hidden. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She had mourned her parents' deaths, but she had also found a kind of peace in believing they had succumbed to natural causes. To learn that they had been murdered, that their deaths had been the continuation of a hunt that began the night they fled Ravenshollow, opened wounds she hadn't known she still carried. Elena has protected you all these years, Marcus continued, moving from village to village, always staying close enough to watch over you, but never close enough to draw attention to your presence. She sacrificed her own comfort, her own safety, to ensure that the Covenant bloodline survived. Elaria thought of the elderly woman who had sat beside her at the feast, whose presence had seemed so naturally comforting. The realization that Elena had been watching over her for decades had essentially dedicated her life to keeping her safe, was both humbling and overwhelming. "Why tell me this now?" she asked. "What's changed that makes this knowledge necessary?" Marcus's expression grew grave. "Because you're not the only one who's been found. Word of your existence has spread beyond Thornwick, and there are already other supernatural houses making inquiries. Some want to use your authority to expand their territories. Others want to eliminate the Covenant bloodlines entirely, believing that without proper arbiters, they can claim whatever power they choose." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small scroll sealed with black wax. "This arrived this afternoon by Raven. Lady Seraphina Dracul has formally requested an audience with the recently discovered Covenant heir. She's one of the most powerful vampire nobles in the Eastern Territories, and she doesn't make requests lightly." Elaria examined the seal, noting the intricate design that seemed to shift and move in the firelight. Even holding it made her skin crawl, as if the parchment itself carried a malevolent presence. "What does she want?" "That's what makes her dangerous," Marcus replied. "Lady Seraphina has spent centuries accumulating power by manipulating the weaknesses in the Covenant system. She's the one who benefits most from the current chaos, and she's not likely to welcome changes that would restore proper order." The implications were becoming clear. Elaria wasn't just a lost heir who had been discovered. She was a potential threat to established power structures that some would kill to preserve. "Lord Matthias doesn't know you brought me these chronicles," she said. It wasn't a question. He would say that knowledge without experience is dangerous, Marcus admitted. That you need to understand your abilities before you learn about the political forces that want to control them. "But I think you deserve to know what you are facing. You're not a child to be protected from harsh realities. You're a woman who's survived, on her own for decades. You have the right to make informed decisions about your own fate." Elaria closed the chronicle and looked at the young-seeming vampire who had risked his position to ensure she understood the true scope of her situation. "What would you do in my place?" "I would learn everything I could," he said without hesitation, "about the Covenant system, about the current political situation, about the abilities you've inherited. And then I would decide whether to accept the role destiny has offered, or find a way to forge my own path." Outside, the village bells tolled the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the snow-covered rooftops. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and quite possibly new threats. But tonight, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, and guided by an unlikely ally, Elaria began to understand that her choices would shape not just her own future, but the fate of two entire peoples. The lost daughter of the Covenant had been found. Now she had to decide what that meant. 3 days after Marcus had shared the village chronicles with her, Elaria found herself in the Manor's chapel for what Lord Matthias had termed a formal assessment. The small stone sanctuary, with its stained glass windows depicting scenes of mortal and immortal figures standing together in harmony, felt more like a courtroom than a place of worship. Arranged on the altar was an array of objects that seemed to hum with their own internal energy, ancient artifacts that had been used for centuries to test and measure Covenant bloodline abilities. Lord Matthias stood beside the altar, his expression grave but not unkind. Beside him, Elena watched with the careful attention of someone who had waited decades for this moment. Father Benedict occupied the front pew, his presence lending an air of solemnity to the proceedings. Most significantly, Lady Seraphina Dracul had arrived the previous evening and now sat with predatory elegance in the shadows near the chapel's entrance. Elaria had seen Lady Seraphina only briefly during her arrival, but the vampire noblewoman's presence had immediately altered the atmosphere of the entire manor. She moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to absolute authority, her pale hair styled in elaborate braids, adorned with silver and obsidian, her clothing rich beyond anything Elaria had ever seen. When she smiled, which she did often, her fangs were clearly visible. Not hidden, as Lord Matthias kept his, but displayed like jewellery. "Lady Elaria," Lord Matthias began formally, "the artifacts before you have been used to assess Covenant bloodline strength for over 4 centuries. With Lady Seraphina as witness, we will determine the extent of your inherited abilities and establish your proper standing within the supernatural community." The centerpiece of the collection was a chalice carved from what appeared to be a single massive pearl, its surface gleaming with an inner light that shifted from silver to gold to deep blue as the angle of view changed. Around it were arranged a crystal sphere, an ornate mirror backed with polished obsidian, several rings set with stones she didn't recognize, and a simple wooden staff that somehow seemed more significant than all the others combined. "The Covenant chalice," Elena explained quietly, "responds only to true bloodline authority. It has remained dormant since your mother last touched it, more than 30 years ago." Elaria approached the altar slowly, acutely aware that every eye in the chapel was upon her. As she drew near the chalice, the pendant beneath her dress grew warm, warmer than it had ever been before. The sensation was not uncomfortable, but it was definitely noticeable, as if the silver disc were awakening to the presence of kindred power. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward the chalice. "Please," Lord Matthias said, though she caught a note of tension in his voice that suggested he was not entirely certain what would happen. The moment her fingertips touched the pearl surface, the chapel filled with light. Not the harsh glare of lightning, but the soft, pervasive illumination of dawn breaking over snow-covered mountains. The chalice grew warm beneath her hands, and she felt a sensation she could only describe as recognition, as if something sleeping within her was finally waking up. Around the chapel, she heard gasps of amazement. Lady Seraphina leaned forward in her seat, her cold blue eyes intent and calculating. But it was Eleanor's expression that caught Elaria's attention, relief so profound it bordered on tears. "Magnificent," Lady Seraphina said, her voice carrying musical undertones that somehow felt dangerous. "The bloodline breeds true, it seems. Tell me, child, what do you feel when you touch the sacred vessel?" Elaria considered the question carefully. The light emanating from the chalice continued to pulse gently, synchronized with her heartbeat, and she could sense connections, threads of energy that seemed to link her to every supernatural being in the room. "I feel responsibility," she said finally, "as if there are ties that bind us all together, and maintaining those connections requires constant attention." "Precisely," Lord Matthias said, his voice carrying approval. "The Covenant system was designed to formalize those connections, to establish clear boundaries and obligations that would prevent conflicts between our peoples. Your bloodline serves as the arbiter of those agreements." Lady Seraphina rose from her seat with fluid grace, moving closer to the altar. And what a valuable arbitration that could be in the right hands. "Tell me, Lord Matthias, have you explained to our young heir the current complications in territorial management?" "I thought it best to establish her capabilities before discussing political applications," Lord Matthias replied carefully. "How considerate." Lady Seraphina's smile grew sharper. "But knowledge delayed is often knowledge denied. Lady Elaria, are you aware that the Eastern Territories currently exist in a state of barely controlled chaos, that vampire houses war with each other over feeding rights, while mortal communities suffer under conflicting authorities. Elaria kept her hands on the chalice, drawing strength from its warm glow. I'm beginning to understand that the current situation is complex. Complex? Lady Seraphina laughed, the sound like ice crystals falling on stone. What a delightfully diplomatic way to describe decades of bloodshed and suffering. The truth, child, is that without proper covenant authority, the supernatural community has devolved into petty feudalism. Territory changes hands based on strength rather than law, and mortal communities are caught in the middle. Father Benedict cleared his throat. With respect, Lady Seraphina, perhaps these discussions would be better held in a more appropriate setting. On the contrary, she replied smoothly, I believe the chapel is entirely appropriate for discussions of moral obligation. Lady Elaria has inherited a position of tremendous authority. How she chooses to use that authority will determine whether peace can be restored or whether the current chaos will continue. Elena stepped forward, her elderly frame somehow managing to project protective authority. Seraphina, the child has been in possession of this knowledge for less than a week. Surely you don't expect her to make decisions of such magnitude without proper preparation. Time is a luxury we may not have, Lady Seraphina replied. Already, word of her existence has spread throughout the supernatural community. Every day we delay provides our enemies more opportunities to organize against us. Our enemies? Elaria asked, still maintaining contact with the chalice. The artifact's warm glow seemed to strengthen her, providing clarity in what was rapidly becoming a web of competing pressures. Those who profit from the current disorder, Lady Seraphina explained. Rogue vampire houses that have claimed territories without legitimate authority. Supernatural beings who prey on mortal communities without restraint. Political figures, both mortal and immortal, who have built their power on the absence of proper oversight. Lord Matthias moved closer to the altar, his expression troubled. Lady Seraphina speaks truth, though perhaps not the whole truth. Restoring covenant authority will indeed threaten those who have prospered during the current chaos. But the process of restoration must be handled carefully, with proper consideration for all parties involved. Careful consideration, Lady Seraphina repeated, her tone suggesting she found the concept distasteful. While innocents suffer and die because proper authority refuses to act decisively. The tension in the chapel was becoming palpable. Elaria could sense the underlying currents of old grudges, political calculation, and genuine concern for different versions of justice. The chalice beneath her hands seemed to pulse more strongly, as if responding to the conflict around it. What exactly are you proposing, Lady Seraphina? Elaria asked directly. Alliance, came the immediate reply. Your bloodline authority combined with my political connections and military resources. Together we could restore order to the Eastern Territories within a matter of months rather than decades. And in exchange? Lady Seraphina's smile became predatory. Recognition of my house's legitimate claims to territories we have protected for the past 40 years. Formal confirmation of feeding rights we have established. Perhaps most importantly, assurance that future covenant decisions will be made with proper consultation of those who have maintained stability during these difficult times. Elena's voice carried warning when she spoke. Be careful, child. Promises made in haste often carry prices that become clear only after they cannot be avoided. But as Elaria looked around the chapel, at Lord Matthias's worried expression, Elena's protective concern, Father Benedict's careful neutrality, and Lady Seraphina's calculating confidence, she began to understand that avoiding decisions was itself a kind of choice. The power flowing through her from the chalice carried with it an acute awareness of the supernatural community's pain and disorder. Somewhere beyond Thornwick's borders, people were suffering because proper authority had abdicated its responsibilities. The question was not whether she would act, but how she would choose to use the abilities she had inherited. The chalice pulsed beneath her hands like a heartbeat, waiting for her decision. The evening following the chapel assessment found Elaria in Lord Matthias's private study, a chamber lined floor to ceiling with ancient tomes and artifacts that spoke of centuries spent accumulating knowledge and wisdom. The fire crackling in the hearth cast dancing shadows across weapons displayed on the walls, swords, daggers, and other implements that bore the patina of age and, she suspected, considerable use. Lord Matthias had requested a private conversation, claiming they needed to discuss practical matters of governance, without the complications introduced by Lady Seraphina's presence. Elena had encouraged the meeting, though Elaria noticed her grandmother's expression carried undertones of worry that suggested even she was not entirely certain what revelations this conversation might bring. "The chalice's response to you was extraordinary," Lord Matthias began, settling into a leather chair across from where Elaria sat near the fire. "I have not seen such a strong reaction since your mother first demonstrated her abilities decades ago. Marcus mentioned that the covenant system is failing," Elaria said carefully, "but he didn't explain why. If the bloodlines carry such authority, why haven't they been used to address the problems Lady Seraphina described?" Lord Matthias was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he appeared to weigh his words. "Because using that authority requires making decisions that affect countless lives, and the consequences of those decisions can echo for generations. Your mother understood this burden, perhaps too well." He rose from his chair and moved to a cabinet secured with multiple locks, withdrawing a leather portfolio bound with silk ribbons. "These are her final reports to the Covenant Council, written in the months before the attack on Ravenshollow. I think you should read them." The documents within were written in Catherine's careful script. The ink faded, but still legible. As Elaria read, she began to understand the impossible position her mother had found herself in. The Covenant system had originally been designed for a simpler world, where territorial boundaries were clear and supernatural populations were small enough to manage through personal relationships. But as both mortal and immortal communities had grown more complex, the old agreements had become inadequate to address emerging conflicts. She was trying to negotiate a complete restructuring of the system, Elaria observed, looking up from a detailed proposal for territorial redistribution. These changes would have affected every supernatural house in existence. "Precisely," Lord Matthias confirmed grimly, which meant that almost everyone had reason to oppose her efforts, those who held territory through historical accident rather than legitimate authority, those who had built their power on the confusion created by unclear boundaries. Even some who might have benefited from clearer rules feared the disruption that change would bring. One document in particular caught Elaria's attention, a detailed analysis of irregular territorial claims that catalogued dozens of instances where vampire houses had expanded their influence beyond traditional boundaries. The list was extensive, but one name appeared repeatedly: House Dracul, under the leadership of Lady Seraphina. She was investigating Lady Seraphina's territorial expansions, Elaria said, a chill of understanding running down her spine. "Among others," Lord Matthias replied carefully. Your mother was scrupulously fair in her investigations. She examined every house's claims, including mine. The difference was that most of us were prepared to accept her authority and adjust our holdings according to her determinations. Lady Seraphina was not. Elaria set the portfolio aside and moved to examine the weapons displayed on the study walls. They were arranged not merely as decoration, but as if they might be needed at a moment's notice. One dagger in particular caught her attention. Its blade was shorter than the others, with an ornate hilt that featured distinctive engravings. "That's a curious design," she commented, pointing to the weapon. Lord Matthias followed her gaze and went perfectly still. "Where have you seen that design before?" "I haven't seen it," Elaria said slowly, a memory surfacing with startling clarity. "But I remember it. The night we fled Raven's Hollow, there was a man with a blade just like that one. I was hiding behind a tapestry in my father's study, and I watched him search through papers on the desk. When my father discovered him..." She stopped, the memory becoming too vivid, too painful. "Your father confronted the assassin," Lord Matthias said gently, "and was killed defending information that would have exposed the conspiracy against your mother's work." "You knew," Elaria whispered, understanding flooding through her. "You knew who killed my father." "I suspected," he admitted. "But suspicion is not proof, and accusations without evidence only create more chaos. That dagger belongs to House Dracul's elite guard. I acquired it from the scene of another assassination, a vampire lord who had been prepared to support your mother's reforms." The implications crashed over her like a wave. Lady Seraphina hadn't simply opposed her mother's efforts to reform the Covenant system. She had orchestrated violence to prevent those reforms from succeeding. The woman who had smiled so charmingly in the chapel, who had spoken so eloquently about the need for decisive action, was quite possibly responsible for her parents' deaths. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Elaria demanded, anger rising in her voice. "Because I needed to see how you would respond to her without preconceptions," Lord Matthias replied honestly. "Your mother's greatest strength was also her greatest weakness. She believed that people could be reached through reason and justice. She couldn't conceive that some individuals would choose chaos over order simply because chaos served their purposes better. And you wanted to see if I would make the same mistake. I wanted to see if you possessed the wisdom to recognize manipulation when it was presented to you." He moved to stand beside her near the weapons display. Lady Seraphina's offer of alliance is seductive because it promises quick solutions to complex problems. But the price of accepting her help would be legitimizing territorial claims that were established through violence and maintained through intimidation. Elaria studied the assassin's blade, its ornate design now seeming sinister rather than beautiful. "What would my mother have done?" "She would have gathered evidence, built consensus among legitimate authorities, and implemented changes gradually to minimize disruption," Lord Matthias replied. "It would have been the right approach for someone who had years to accomplish her goals. You may not have that luxury." "Meaning?" "Meaning that Lady Seraphina's presence here is not simply a diplomatic courtesy. She's testing your resolve, determining whether you can be influenced or whether you represent a genuine threat to her accumulated power. Based on what she observes, she will either attempt to co-opt you or eliminate you." The fire in the hearth popped, sending sparks up the chimney and casting new shadows across the weapons on the walls. Elaria felt the weight of her inheritance settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The simple life of a traveling healer seemed impossibly distant now, replaced by responsibilities that could reshape the supernatural world, or get her killed in the attempt. Marcus believes I should learn everything I can before making major decisions, she said thoughtfully. Marcus is young and idealistic, Lord Matthias replied, though his tone carried affection rather than criticism. He sees the world as it should be rather than as it is. That perspective has value, but it can also be dangerous when dealing with individuals who have spent centuries perfecting the art of manipulation. And what do you believe I should do? Lord Matthias was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. I believe you should trust your instincts. Your bloodline carries more than just magical ability. It carries generations of accumulated wisdom about leadership, justice, and the delicate balance required to maintain peace between conflicting interests. Listen to that wisdom. It will serve you better than any advice I could offer. Outside the study windows, snow had begun falling again, blanketing Thornwick in pristine white that would hide the village's secrets until spring. But inside the warm chamber, surrounded by the artifacts of supernatural politics and the weight of inherited responsibility, Elaria began to understand that some secrets could no longer remain hidden. The time for passive observation was ending. Soon she would have to choose not just how to respond to Lady Seraphina's overtures, but how to honor her parents' memory while forging her own path forward. The dagger on the wall gleamed in the firelight, a reminder that in the world of supernatural politics, the stakes were always life and death. The revelation came not through careful investigation or dramatic confrontation, but through a simple accident that changed everything Elaria thought she understood about the past 30 years of her life. She had been alone in Lord Matthias's study the following morning, reviewing her mother's reports while he attended to correspondence with other supernatural houses. The fire had burned low during the night, and she was attempting to add another log when she knocked over a small wooden box that had been sitting on the mantelpiece, the contents scattered across the stone hearth, several crystals, a few pieces of old jewelry, and what appeared to be a simple river stone. As she knelt to gather the items, her fingers closed around the stone, and the world exploded into light and memory. But these were not her memories. She was seeing through someone else's eyes, experiencing events from decades past with startling clarity. The vision thrust her into the midst of a moonless night at Raven's Hollow, but from a perspective she had never witnessed before. She watched her father's study from outside the window, saw figures moving stealthily through the corridors, heard the clash of steel that had awakened her as a child. But the assassins, she could see their faces clearly now, and none of them belonged to Lady Seraphina's house. Instead, she watched in growing horror as vampires bearing the colors of House Blackthorn moved through the castle with deadly efficiency. She saw Lord Matthias himself, looking exactly as he did now despite the passage of decades, directing the assault with quiet authority. The memory stone, for that was clearly what she held, showed her the truth of that terrible night from his perspective. But it was not the truth she had expected. She watched as Lord Matthias's forces systematically eliminated not her family, but the actual assassins who had been sent to murder them. She saw him fighting desperately to reach her father's study before the real killers could complete their mission. She witnessed his genuine anguish when he arrived moments too late to prevent her father's death. And then she saw something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the attack on Raven's Hollow. Lady Seraphina stood in the shadows of the castle's great hall, directing a group of black-clad figures toward the family quarters. Her elegant features were twisted with cold satisfaction as she orchestrated the slaughter that was meant to eliminate the entire Montrose bloodline. But her plan had been interrupted by Lord Matthias's unexpected arrival. He had come to warn the family, not to destroy them. The memory stone showed her parents' final moments with devastating clarity. Her father, mortally wounded, but still protecting the secret documents that contained evidence of Lady Seraphina's territorial violations. Her mother, using the last of her strength to activate a magical ward that would hide their daughter until help could arrive. Lord Matthias, arriving just in time to see Catherine Montrose die in her husband's arms, her final words a whispered plea to protect their child. What followed was Lord Matthias's desperate race to find Elaria before Lady Seraphina's remaining assassins could locate her. The memory stone revealed his relief when he discovered the magical ward had kept her hidden, his careful arrangement for her escape through passages Elena had prepared, and his decades-long vigil to ensure that Lady Seraphina never learned she had survived. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Elaria gasping on the stone floor of the study, the memory stone still clutched in her trembling hand. Everything she thought she understood about that night, about Lord Matthias's role in her family's destruction, about Lady Seraphina's current motivations. All of it had been wrong. The door to the study opened, and Lord Matthias entered, stopping short when he saw her sitting among the scattered contents of the overturned box. His eyes immediately found the glowing stone in her hand, and his expression shifted to one of profound resignation. "You've seen it," he said simply. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" she demanded, struggling to her feet. "All this time, I've been afraid of you, suspicious of your motives, when you were the one who saved my life." "Because the truth would have made you a target sooner than necessary," he replied, moving to help her steady herself. "As long as Lady Seraphina believed I might have been complicit in your family's deaths, she felt secure in her position. If she had known that I possessed evidence of her guilt, she would have tried to eliminate that evidence," Elaria finished, understanding flooding through her. "By killing both of us." "Precisely." Lord Matthias took the memory stone from her hands, its glow fading as it lost contact with her covenant bloodline. "This stone contains the complete record of that night. Not just what I witnessed, but magical impressions left by your parents in their final moments. It's evidence that could destroy Lady Seraphina's claims to legitimacy and expose the conspiracy that has maintained her power for 3 decades. Elaria sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had learned. Then why is she here? Why risk exposure by coming to Thornwick? "Because she's grown desperate," Lord Matthias explained. "The supernatural community has become increasingly unstable. Rogue vampire houses are challenging established territories. Mortal communities are beginning to organize resistance against supernatural authority. Without legitimate covenant oversight, the entire system is on the verge of collapse. And she needs my authority to legitimize her position before everything falls apart," Elaria said, pieces of the political puzzle finally falling into place. "More than that," Lord Matthias said grimly. "She needs to eliminate the evidence of her crimes before someone else discovers it. The memory stone is not the only artifact that contains records of her illegal activities. Your mother was very thorough in her investigations." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared in the study doorway, his expression urgent. "Lord Matthias, we have a problem. Lady Seraphina has requested a private audience with Lady Elaria this afternoon. She claims it's a matter of mutual benefit and urgent necessity." "She knows," Elaria said with sudden certainty. "Somehow, she's realized that you have evidence against her." Lord Matthias nodded grimly. "Which means the time for careful diplomacy has ended. She'll either try to force your cooperation or eliminate the threat I represent," Elaria finished. along with anyone who might support my legitimate claims to Covenant authority." Marcus stepped fully into the study, his young face set with determination. "Then we need to act first. If we can gather support from other supernatural houses, present the evidence publicly." "Evidence can be discredited. Witnesses can be intimidated," Lord Matthias interrupted. "Lady Seraphina has spent decades building a network of allies who benefit from the current chaos. They won't abandon her easily." "Then what do you propose?" Elaria asked, feeling the weight of her inherited authority settling around her shoulders like armor. The frightened woman who had stumbled into supernatural politics a week ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that hesitation could cost not just her own life, but the stability of 2 entire communities. "We use her overconfidence against her," Lord Matthias said, moving to a locked drawer in his desk and withdrawing several additional memory stones. "She believes she can manipulate or intimidate you into compliance. She doesn't yet realize that you've inherited more than just your mother's bloodline authority. You've inherited her intelligence and her commitment to justice." Elaria examined the additional stones, each one pulsing with faint magical energy. "What are these?" "Records of her crimes dating back 40 years, he replied. "Illegal territorial seizures, assassinations, agreements broken, and treaties violated. Everything your mother was investigating before her death, plus evidence I've gathered in the years since. You've been building a case against her all this time." "I've been preparing for the day when someone with the authority to act would finally emerge," Lord Matthias corrected. "You are that authority, Elaria. The question is whether you're prepared to use it." Outside the study windows, snow continued to fall over Thornwick, blanketing the village in deceptive peace. But Elaria could sense the undercurrents of tension that ran beneath that peaceful surface. Supernatural beings positioning themselves for conflict, mortal communities caught between competing authorities, and at the center of it all, a woman whose decades of accumulated power had been built on a foundation of murder and deception. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "That we give Lady Seraphina exactly what she thinks she wants," Lord Matthias replied with a smile that held no warmth. "A private meeting with the Covenant heir. But instead of negotiation or intimidation, she'll find herself facing a formal tribunal convened under the ancient laws she's spent so long violating." "A tribunal? The Covenant bloodlines carry more than just arbitration authority," Marcus explained, understanding dawning in his expression. "They have the power to convene formal judgments for supernatural crimes. If we can present the evidence properly, under the old laws, Lady Seraphina will find herself facing justice for the first time in centuries," Lord Matthias finished. "But it will require courage, Elaria, and the willingness to accept that your choices from this point forward will affect the fate of everyone in the supernatural community." Elaria looked around the study, at the weapons that spoke of centuries of conflict, at the books that contained the accumulated wisdom of supernatural law, at the memory stones that held the truth about her family's murder. Then she thought of the little boy she had saved from drowning, of the villagers who had welcomed her with such warmth, of the responsibility that pulsed through the Covenant chalice when she touched it. "Tell me what I need to do." The preparations for what would effectively be a supernatural trial began immediately, though they had to be conducted with absolute secrecy. Lady Seraphina's network of allies and informants extended throughout the region, and any hint that evidence was being gathered against her would likely trigger immediate retaliation. Elena proved invaluable in these efforts, her decades of experience in supernatural politics revealing depths of knowledge that even Lord Matthias had not fully appreciated. She had spent the years since Catherine's death not just protecting Elaria, but quietly building relationships with vampire houses and mortal communities that had suffered under Lady Seraphina's expanding influence. The key, Elena explained as they gathered in the manor's secure chamber, deep beneath the main building, is not just presenting evidence of past crimes, but demonstrating that those crimes continue to threaten the stability of the entire supernatural community. The chamber itself was a marvel of medieval engineering and magical protection. Ancient stones formed perfect circles, carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. At the center of the room stood a raised platform where the binding circle had been inscribed, a collection of interwoven patterns that could channel and focus covenant authority with tremendous precision. Marcus had spent the morning arranging communications with sympathetic supernatural houses throughout the region. The responses had been encouraging. Decades of Lady Seraphina's territorial expansion had created numerous enemies who would welcome an opportunity to see her power curtailed. But they would need to move carefully, as open opposition would likely provoke the very conflict they were trying to prevent. "How many can we count on for support?" Elaria asked, examining the list of responses Marcus had compiled. 12 houses have agreed to send representatives, he replied. Not enough to guarantee a favorable outcome, but sufficient to provide legitimacy for the proceedings. More importantly, several mortal communities have agreed to send witnesses who can testify about the effects of Lady Seraphina's policies on their territories. Lord Matthias was arranging the memory stones and other evidence on a series of carved pedestals around the binding circle. Each artifact had been carefully documented and verified, creating an archive of supernatural crimes that stretched back 4 decades. "The challenge," he observed, "will be presenting this information in a way that cannot be dismissed or discredited." "Which is where the ancient laws work in our favor," Elena said with satisfaction. "Under covenant protocols, memory stones created by dying individuals carry the weight of sworn testimony. Lady Seraphina cannot dispute their validity without challenging the fundamental principles that legitimize supernatural authority." Elaria studied the binding circle, feeling the power that emanated from its carved lines. When she extended her hand toward the inscribed patterns, the symbols flared with silver light that seemed to respond to her bloodline. "What exactly will happen when I activate this?" "The circle will create a zone of absolute truth," Lord Matthias explained. "No deception, no mental manipulation, no supernatural influence beyond what is specifically permitted by covenant law. Everyone within the circle will be compelled to speak honestly about matters directly related to the charges being presented. And Lady Seraphina will have no choice but to participate. If she refuses, she essentially admits guilt," Eleanor replied. "The covenant system only functions when all parties accept the authority of the bloodlines to arbitrate disputes. By requesting an audience with you, she's already acknowledged your legitimacy. Backing down now would destroy her political position." Marcus looked up from his preparations, his expression troubled. "There's something else we need to consider. Lady Seraphina didn't come to Thornwick alone. She brought a significant retinue, including several vampires I don't recognize. If this tribunal doesn't go as she expects, she may attempt to resolve the situation through violence," Lord Matthias finished grimly. "Which is why we've taken certain precautions." He gestured toward the chamber's walls, where Elaria now noticed additional carved symbols that seemed different from the binding circle's patterns. These glowed with a harsh blue light that made her skin tingle unpleasantly. "Containment wards," Elena explained. "Once activated, they prevent anyone from leaving the chamber until the proceedings are formally concluded. Lady Seraphina may bring her allies, but she won't be able to escape if the evidence proves damning." Won't that seem like a trap? Elaria asked, concerned about the ethics of essentially imprisoning their opponents. The wards are traditional for formal tribunals, Lord Matthias assured her. They ensure that all parties remain present to face the consequences of the judgment. Lady Seraphina will recognize them as legitimate, even if she doesn't appreciate their implications. Father Benedict arrived as they were making final preparations, carrying a leather satchel that clinked with the sound of metal objects. "The blessed silver," he announced, setting the bag carefully on a side table. "Enough for every representative who'll be attending the tribunal." "Blessed silver?" Elaria asked. "A precaution," Elena explained. "While the binding circle compels truth, it doesn't prevent other forms of supernatural manipulation. Blessed silver provides protection against mental influence, ensuring that the judgment will be based on evidence rather than magical coercion." As the afternoon progressed, representatives from the sympathetic supernatural houses began arriving in Thornwick. They came discreetly, often in the guise of merchants or travelers, but Elaria could sense the power they carried. These were individuals who had survived centuries of supernatural politics, and their willingness to support her cause spoke to the depth of resentment Lady Seraphina's actions had generated. One arrival in particular caught her attention, a vampire who appeared to be a young woman, but whose presence radiated authority that suggested extreme age. She introduced herself simply as Lydia, and claimed to represent the northern territories that bordered several of Lady Seraphina's contested holdings. "I knew your mother," Lydia said quietly when she was introduced to Elaria in the Manor's reception hall. Catherine was one of the few covenant arbiters who understood that justice requires not just impartiality, but courage. I hope you've inherited both qualities. I'm learning that courage is easier to find when you understand what you're fighting for, Elaria replied. Good. Lydia's smile revealed fangs that gleamed like polished ivory. Because what we're attempting tonight will either restore legitimate authority to the supernatural community or trigger a conflict that could destroy both our peoples. As evening approached, the tension in the manor became palpable. Servants moved through the halls with unusual efficiency, ensuring that everything was prepared for what would ostensibly be a formal dinner, but would actually serve as cover for the tribunal. The great hall had been arranged to accommodate the supernatural representatives while maintaining the appearance of a social gathering. Lady Seraphina arrived precisely at sunset, resplendent in a gown of midnight blue silk adorned with diamonds that caught the torchlight like captured stars. Her retinue was impressive, 6 vampires who moved with the coordinated precision of elite guards, plus several individuals whose supernatural nature was less obvious, but whose presence radiated barely contained menace. "Lady Elaria," she said, with a gracious smile that didn't reach her cold blue eyes. "How lovely to see you again. I trust you've given consideration to our previous conversation about mutual cooperation." "Indeed," Elaria replied carefully. "I've spent considerable time reflecting on questions of authority and responsibility. Perhaps we might discuss them in a more private setting." "Precisely what I was hoping to hear." Lady Seraphina's smile grew sharper. "I have several proposals that I believe you'll find quite compelling." As the evening progressed through the motions of a formal dinner, Elaria felt the weight of anticipation building around her. The supernatural representatives maintained careful conversation about neutral topics, but she could sense the underlying tension as everyone waited for the moment when pretense would be abandoned and the real business of the evening would begin. Eleanor sat beside her throughout the meal, occasionally offering quiet encouragement or subtle observations about the gathered company. "Lady Seraphina's confidence is remarkable," she murmured during one course. "She genuinely believes she can manipulate the situation to her advantage. Can she? Elaria asked quietly. That depends entirely on you, Elena replied. The authority is yours by birthright, but how you choose to use it will determine the outcome. Remember, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of fear because the cause is just. As the meal concluded and servants began clearing the tables, Lord Matthias rose from his seat at the head table. Lady Seraphina, Lady Elaria, if you would join me. I believe the private conversation you requested can now proceed. Lady Seraphina's expression showed a flicker of surprise as she noticed how many of the dinner guests were also rising to accompany them. I had rather hoped for a more intimate discussion. Oh, but this will be very intimate indeed, Lord Matthias replied with a smile that held no warmth. You see, Lady Elaria has decided to invoke her bloodline authority to address certain irregularities that have come to her attention. As the affected parties, I thought you might appreciate the opportunity to respond to those concerns directly. The colour drained from Lady Seraphina's face as understanding dawned. Around the hall, her retinue tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons as they realized that what they had assumed would be a negotiation was about to become something else entirely. You cannot be serious, Lady Seraphina said, her musical voice carrying undertones of ice. You would dare to arrange some sort of ambush under the guise of hospitality? Not an ambush, Elaria said, rising to her feet and feeling the covenant authority flowing through her like warm silver. Justice, which has been delayed far too long. The silver pendant beneath her dress grew warm as she spoke, and around the hall the assembled supernatural representatives straightened in recognition of power properly invoked. Whatever happened next, there would be no more hiding behind political maneuvering or diplomatic niceties. The time for truth had finally arrived. The procession to the underground chamber moved with the solemnity of a funeral march. Lady Seraphina's retinue flanked her on both sides, their hands resting on weapon hilts as they assessed the supernatural representatives who formed an escort rather than a guard. The tension was thick enough to taste, a metallic bitterness that spoke of violence barely held in check. This is highly irregular, Lady Seraphina observed as they descended the stone steps carved deep into the manor's foundations. Tribunal proceedings require formal notice and time for preparation of defense. The Covenant bloodlines have emergency authority to convene immediate hearings when evidence of ongoing crimes comes to light, Elena replied smoothly. I believe you'll find the protocols quite properly followed. The chamber awaited them in all its ancient majesty. The binding circle glowed with soft silver light, its intricate patterns seeming to shift and pulse as if alive. The containment wards along the walls had been activated, creating a barrier that shimmered like heat waves rising from summer stone. Memory stones and other evidence occupied their positions around the circle's perimeter, each artifact pulsing with the weight of accumulated testimony. Lady Seraphina stopped just inside the chamber entrance, her cold blue eyes taking in every detail of the prepared space. I see. This was never intended to be a negotiation. No, Elaria said, moving to stand at the center of the binding circle. As her feet touched the inscribed patterns, the entire chamber filled with resonant light that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. This is a formal tribunal convened under ancient covenant authority to address charges of territorial violation, conspiracy to commit murder, and systematic breach of supernatural law. The transformation in Lady Seraphina's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The facade of gracious nobility fell away, replaced by something far older and infinitely more dangerous. Her beautiful features hardened into an expression of predatory calculation, and when she smiled, Her fangs were fully visible. "You foolish child," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made several of the supernatural representatives step back involuntarily. "Do you have any idea what forces you're challenging? The current territorial arrangements exist because they represent the natural order, the strong ruling over the weak. Your mother's naive idealism died with her, and yours will die with you." "The strong ruling over the weak," Lord Matthias repeated as he took his position within the circle. An interesting perspective from someone who built her power through assassination and treachery rather than legitimate authority. Lady Seraphina's gaze snapped to him, and for the first time since entering the chamber, Elaria saw something that might have been uncertainty flicker across her features. "Careful, Matthias. There are secrets in this room that you might prefer remained buried." "On the contrary," he replied, gesturing toward the memory stones arranged around the circle's perimeter. "I believe it's time for all secrets to be revealed." Elaria placed her hand on the ornate crown that had been positioned at the circle's exact center, an artifact of covenant authority that had been crafted specifically for formal tribunals. The moment her fingers touched the ancient gold and silver, the entire chamber resonated with power that seemed to connect her to every supernatural being present. "By the authority vested in the covenant bloodlines," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stone chamber, "I formally convene this tribunal to examine evidence of crimes against supernatural law. Lady Seraphina Dracul, you stand accused of territorial violations, conspiracy to commit murder, and systematic breach of the ancient pacts that govern relations between our peoples." "I recognize no such authority," Lady Seraphina replied, but her words lacked the confidence they had carried moments before. The binding circle was already affecting her, compelling honesty even as she tried to maintain her defiant stance. "You recognized my authority when you requested this meeting," Elaria pointed out. "The covenant system only functions when all parties acknowledge the legitimacy of the bloodlines to arbitrate disputes. You cannot selectively accept that authority based on your expectations of favorable outcomes." Marcus stepped forward, carrying the first of the memory stones. "The tribunal will begin with evidence regarding the attack on Raven's Hollow 30 years ago. This memory stone contains the final testimony of William Montrose, recorded in the moments before his death." As he placed the stone within the circle's inner ring, it began to glow with increasing intensity. The chamber filled with images that hung in the air like ghostly projections, scenes from that terrible night when Elaria's family had faced assassination. But now, viewed through the lens of her father's dying memories, the truth became undeniable. Lady Seraphina's face appeared clearly in the projections, directing black-clad assassins through the castle corridors. Her voice could be heard giving orders for the elimination of every member of the bloodline, including the child. "Impressive magical theatre," Lady Seraphina said, though her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Memory stones can be altered, their contents manipulated by skilled practitioners." "Not when they're sealed with covenant blood," Elena said firmly. "These stones were created using protocols that make tampering impossible. The magic recognizes deception and would shatter any stone that contained false memories." Lady Seraphina's composure cracked visibly as the implications sank in. Around the chamber, the supernatural representatives watched with growing amazement and horror as evidence of decades of crimes unfolded before them. The memory stones revealed not just the attack on Raven's Hollow, but a systematic campaign of territorial expansion built on violence and intimidation. "This proves nothing," Lady Seraphina said desperately. "The Montrose family was corrupt, their covenant authority illegitimate. I acted to protect the supernatural, community from their destructive influence. Then you won't mind explaining why your territorial claims expanded by 300% in the years following their deaths, Marcus said, producing a detailed map that showed the progression of Lady Seraphina's holdings over time. The evidence was damning, but Elaria could see that Lady Seraphina was far from defeated. Her retinue remained poised for action, and there was something in her expression that suggested she had prepared for this possibility. "You want to play by the old rules," Lady Seraphina said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Very well. I invoke the ancient right of trial by combat. Let your precious bloodline authority prove itself against 5 centuries of accumulated power." The chamber fell silent as the full implications of her challenge became clear. Under the oldest supernatural laws, trial by combat superseded all other forms of judgment, but the consequences of such a confrontation could destroy everyone present. Elaria felt the covenant crown growing warm beneath her hands as ancient protocols awakened to recognize the formal challenge. Whatever happened next would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the entire supernatural community. The ancient right of trial by combat transformed the chamber from a place of judicial proceedings into an arena where centuries of supernatural law would be decided through raw power. Lady Seraphina's invocation of the old protocols had triggered responses built into the very stones of the chamber. The binding circle expanded, creating a larger space for combat, while the containment wards strengthened to ensure that whatever happened here would not spill beyond these walls. "Combat between principals or champions?" Lord Matthias asked, his voice carrying formal precision despite the tension that filled the chamber. "Principals," Lady Seraphina replied immediately, her cold gaze fixed on Elaria. "Let the Covenant bloodline prove its worth against those who have maintained actual power while they hid in obscurity." Elaria felt the weight of 5 centuries of supernatural politics settling on her shoulders. She had inherited abilities she barely understood, faced an opponent with decades of combat experience, and stood before witnesses whose future loyalty would depend entirely on the outcome of the next few minutes. But as she looked around the chamber, at Elena's encouraging nod, at Marcus's determined expression, at Lord Matthias's steady confidence, she realized that this moment had been inevitable from the instant she spoke Latin at the winter feast. Some conflicts could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise. "I accept the challenge," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stone chamber. Lady Seraphina's smile was predatory as she began removing her elaborate jewelry and outer garments, revealing a form that moved with fluid grace despite her apparent age. "You understand, of course, that trial by combat is to the death. There can be no mercy, no surrender, no appeal of the outcome." "I understand," Elaria replied, though her heart raced with the implications. She had never engaged in formal combat, had spent her adult life healing rather than harming. But the Covenant crown beneath her hands pulsed with ancient power, and she could feel knowledge awakening within her. Muscle memory inherited through bloodline connections to generations of women who had stood in similar circumstances. The soul mirror was brought forward and positioned at the circle's edge, a reflective obsidian surface that would show the true nature of each combatant to all witnesses. As Lady Seraphina approached it, her reflection revealed something that made several representatives gasp in horror. Her beautiful features remained, but overlaid with images of the countless lives she had destroyed, the territories she had stolen, the suffering she had caused in her centuries of accumulated power. When Elaria stood before the mirror, her reflection showed something entirely different. the steady glow of someone who had spent her life in service to others, surrounded by the ghostly figures of those she had healed, the children she had saved, the communities she had helped. The Covenant bloodline manifested a silver light that connected her to every supernatural being present, showing her role as mediator and protector. "Impressive display," Lady Seraphina said dismissively, "but good intentions won't save you from 5 centuries of combat experience." The formal combat began without ceremony or warning. Lady Seraphina moved with inhuman speed, her form blurring as she attacked with claws that had been enhanced through decades of alchemical modification. But Elaria found herself responding with abilities she hadn't known she possessed. The Covenant bloodline didn't just carry authority and wisdom, it carried the accumulated combat knowledge of every previous heir who had faced similar challenges. She dodged Lady Seraphina's first strike by mere inches, feeling supernatural claws tear through the air where her throat had been moments before. But instead of stumbling or falling, she found herself moving with fluid grace that matched her opponent's enhanced speed. "Impossible!" Lady Seraphina hissed as her second attack was deflected by a barrier of silver light that manifested around Elaria's hands. Covenant bloodlines don't carry combat abilities. They carry whatever abilities are necessary to maintain the balance, Elena called out from the circle's edge, her elderly voice carrying notes of fierce pride. "Your mistake was assuming that balance could only be maintained through passive arbitration." The battle escalated quickly. Lady Seraphina's attacks became more vicious, more desperate, as she realized that her opponent was not the helpless healer she had expected. Supernatural power filled the chamber. Shadows that moved independently, ice that formed and shattered with each exchange, and underlying it all, the silver light of Covenant authority that seemed to strengthen with every moment. But the true turning point came when Lady Seraphina, frustrated by her inability to land a decisive blow, made a critical error. She attempted to use mental manipulation, a direct violation of trial by combat protocols that required purely physical confrontation. The moment her power touched Elaria's mind, the soul mirror flared with blinding light. Lady Seraphina's violation of the ancient rules triggered a backlash that left her momentarily stunned. And in that instant of vulnerability, Elaria struck. But instead of delivering a killing blow, she channeled the full authority of the Covenant bloodline into a binding that would have been impossible outside the sacred circle. Silver light surrounded Lady Seraphina, holding her motionless as the accumulated weight of centuries of supernatural law pressed down upon her. "You have violated the terms of trial by combat," Elaria said, her voice carrying harmonics of power that resonated through the chamber stones. "Do you yield to the authority of the Covenant bloodline?" Lady Seraphina struggled against the binding, her beautiful features twisted with rage and desperation. Around the chamber, witnesses watched in stunned silence as 5 centuries of accumulated power met its match in ancient authority properly wielded. The outcome would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of supernatural law itself. The silver light of Covenant authority slowly faded from the chamber, as Lady Seraphina remained bound within Elaria's power, her centuries of accumulated strength rendered useless against the ancient laws she had violated. Around the stone circle, supernatural representatives witnessed something that had not occurred for generations, legitimate authority properly exercised with both wisdom and restraint. "Do you yield to the authority of the Covenant bloodline?" Elaria repeated, her voice carrying the weight of inherited power, but also the gentleness that had defined her life as a healer. Lady Seraphina's struggle against the binding ceased, and for the first time in centuries, something approaching humility crossed her beautiful features. The soul mirror continued to reflect her true nature, the accumulated suffering she had caused, the lives destroyed by her ambitions, the corruption that had spread through the supernatural community under her influence. "I yield," she whispered, the words seeming to tear something fundamental from her very being. The binding released immediately, but Lady Seraphina made no attempt to renew hostilities. Instead, she sank to her knees within the circle, the full weight of her crimes finally visible to herself as well as to the assembled witnesses. Elaria approached slowly, her hand reaching for the scroll she had prepared. The new covenant that would replace the ancient agreements with protocols designed for the modern world. As she unrolled the parchment, its contents became visible to all present, written in careful script that combined legal precision with genuine wisdom. "The old pacts served their purpose," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "But they were designed for a simpler time. The supernatural community has grown beyond the boundaries of medieval politics and territorial feudalism. What we need now are agreements that protect both mortal and immortal communities, while acknowledging the realities of our current world. The new covenant outlined territorial boundaries based on mutual consent rather than historical conquest. It established clear protocols for resolving disputes through arbitration rather than violence. Most importantly, it created oversight mechanisms that would prevent future corruption, while preserving the autonomy that both communities required to thrive." Marcus stepped forward, his young face reflecting amazement at what had been accomplished. "This is remarkable. You've managed to address every major source of conflict that has destabilized the region for decades." "Not alone," Elaria replied, looking around the chamber at the individuals who had supported her through the crisis. Elena provided the historical knowledge necessary to understand how the old system had failed. Lord Matthias contributed the evidence that made justice possible. You ensured that the younger generation would have a voice in shaping the future. Lady Seraphina slowly rose to her feet, her posture no longer carrying the predatory confidence that had defined her for centuries. "What happens to my territories? To the houses that supported my claims? Territories obtained through legitimate means will be confirmed under the new agreements," Elaria replied. "Holdings seized through violence or deception will be returned to their rightful communities, or redistributed according to genuine need. Your supporters will have the opportunity to accept the new covenant and maintain their standing within the supernatural community." "And me?" Elaria studied the ancient vampire who had orchestrated decades of suffering in pursuit of personal power. The easy path would be execution, swift justice for crimes that had cost countless lives. But as she looked into Lady Seraphina's eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected, the possibility of genuine remorse. "You will face trial for your crimes in every territory where you committed them," she said finally. "But those trials will be conducted under the new covenant with proper representation and genuine opportunities for redemption. Justice requires accountability, but it doesn't necessarily require destruction." The transformation in Lady Seraphina's expression was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time in perhaps centuries, someone with the power to destroy her had chosen mercy over vengeance. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "My mother spent her life trying to create a system where conflicts could be resolved without violence," Elaria explained. "Killing you would certainly remove a source of instability, but it wouldn't address the underlying problems that allowed corruption to flourish. Real change requires building something better, not just destroying what came before." Lord Matthias approached, his expression carrying relief, so profound it bordered on exhaustion. "The burden you've carried all these years," Elaria said to him, "protecting evidence, watching for threats, maintaining vigilance against forces you couldn't directly challenge. That's over now. Yes, he replied simply. For the first time in decades, I can look toward the future instead of constantly guarding against the past. Around the chamber, the supernatural representatives began signing the new covenant, their formal acceptance creating a binding agreement that would reshape supernatural politics throughout the region. But more than legal documentation, their signatures represented a commitment to building relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear. Elena approached as the formal proceedings concluded, her elderly face glowing with pride and satisfaction. "Your parents would be so proud," she said, embracing Elaria with the warmth of genuine family affection. "You've accomplished everything they dreamed of and more." "What happens now?" Marcus asked, as they prepared to leave the chamber where so much had been decided. "Now we build," Elaria replied, looking around at the faces of those who would help shape the supernatural community's future. The hard work of implementing these agreements, of rebuilding trust between communities, of proving that cooperation serves everyone better than conflict. Father Benedict, who had witnessed the proceedings with quiet amazement, stepped forward. "Thornwick has always been a place where different worlds could meet safely. Perhaps it can serve as a model for other communities." As they ascended from the chamber into the manor's main levels, Elaria felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling into something more comfortable. Not a burden imposed by bloodline, but a calling chosen freely. The frightened woman who had spoken Latin at a village feast seemed like someone from another lifetime, replaced by someone who understood that true authority came not from power over others, but from the wisdom to serve something greater than oneself. Outside the manor windows, dawn was breaking over Thornwick, painting the snow-covered village in shades of gold and rose. The winter feast had ended, but something far more significant had begun. A new chapter in supernatural history, written not in blood and conquest, but in the patient work of building bridges between worlds. The Covenant daughter had found her way home, and in doing so had shown everyone else the path forward.